Welcome to A.U.M. We are recorded live, and I'm your host, Callie Fedesinko. Wait, don't tune out. I know I just said that we're recorded live, and you feel deceived because we advertise this as a live stream. But would it make a difference if I told you it's my doctor's fault? They wouldn't see me at any other time? No? Well, what if I told you that watching this recording will give you the tools you need to start your own podcast? All right, I thought so. So, like I was saying, I'm your host, Callie Fedesinko of Callie Collective, a digital marketing agency designed to build relationships between financial advisors and their target audience through data driven custom content and advertising. Today, we're talking with Justin Peters of SimplePod Studios about how hosting his own podcast, The Struggle is Real, led to helping others produce their podcasts. We'll be asking him about how to get started and the best equipment to use. So make sure that you still ask your questions in the comments. Unfortunately, we won't address them in the video, but we will respond in comments back to you.
Callie, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have you. For our guests who are tuning in, I met Justin at FinCon, which is this financial content conference where I learned a lot and my head is still spinning from back in October.
Yeah, that's a fun conference every single year. It's like this will be my fourth year attending in 2024, and now I'm like, it's just a party with my friends. It's such a good conference in terms of content and execution, but also I just love all the people that I've met there and getting to see friends again. So yeah, I'm glad we got a chance to meet.
Same. I feel like it's a very collaborative conference, which is unusual and what I've experienced in the past. So, Justin, let's talk podcasts. Like you, our audience isn't professional podcasters, or they don't come from professional podcast background, I should say. They're financial advisors who are starting a podcast on the side, usually as a way to market themselves. So, of course, it can be rather daunting for them to get started. So, as someone who started a podcast on the side, what's your advice to someone else who's getting started?
Kelly, I'm going to give you the most cliche answer to this question, and that is literally just get started. So, quick backstory on me. 4 years ago, I started a podcast called The Struggle is Real. We're still producing that today as our own original show. But I actually started that project, quote, quote, started that project 8 months before when I bought my first two mics. And what happened is I bought those mics. I was like, cool, I'm going to podcast. I put those mics on a shelf. I started doing all of this research. What do I need to do? And I got overwhelmed and paralyzed by all the decisions, all the to-do list items. And I finally didn't really get started on podcasting until 6 days before my first episode went live.
No.
It was crazy. I took a self-made sabbatical. I was like, you know what? I want to start podcasting as part of this sabbatical.
Yeah.
And I called my best friend. We booked a date and decided to do a recording. And I swear I did more in those 6 days than the 8 months prior actually getting a podcast up and going. So I know it's a cliche answer, but literally get started and through that movement and momentum, you're going to want to naturally improve and get better at what you're doing.
That's a great tip. And so through producing your podcast, that led to you creating your production company. Why was that? Like, why were you like, I'm going to also produce more podcasts?
This happened
that much?
this happened on accident. And yes, most people, if you're a podcaster right now, you're like, I struggle with producing my own podcast, let alone wanting to produce more podcast on the side.
Yeah.
So it totally happened by accident. My brother, as a solo hobbyist podcaster for 2 years, until my brother gave me a call one day and was like, hey man, your audio absolutely sucks. Can I please help you? And I was like, yes, like, of course. Like, I loved all things podcasting except for the editing and production work. That was my least favorite part. I was always like, listening to other podcasts, reading books, like trying to develop a skill of being a good host and develop good processes around podcasting. But the thing I always dreaded was editing. So I was refusing to learn how to be a good editor. I just didn't enjoy watching YouTube videos on audio engineering. And my brother called me and was like, yeah. I'm like, yep, sign yourself up. Let's do this. He joined the team. And then about a month or two after that, he asked me, he was like, hey, Justin, I think I'm actually going to start freelancing and actually try to make this a full-time gig for me. Would
Mm,
you mind introducing me or helping me get some clients?
mhm,
And after 2 years of podcasting and the boom that came out of 2021 podcasting when everybody was stuck inside from COVID, I was getting calls every day like,
mm.
hey man, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Can I pick your brain? Or like, hey, I started a podcast. Can you help me with this thing? So I had a Rolodex of a lot of podcasters and I was like, sure, let me ask around and see if anyone needs help with editing. And honestly, I just had so much fun helping my brother start his freelance business that we ended up building a podcast agency ourselves.
That is like such a great story. I love so now that you've got this podcast editing production studio, I should say, what would you say makes the difference between an amateur and a professional in podcasting?
So you gave me a list of questions to
Yeah.
prep, and this was on there. And this was the one that I took a little bit of time to think about because I wasn't really quite sure. Like, is
Yeah.
it once you start monetizing, is that when you become a professional? Is there certain growth metrics that if you hit those, you become a professional? And at the end of the day, I pretty much decided that you go from amateur to professional podcaster whenever you start taking your podcast professionally. And what I mean by that is setting up systems. It could
Mhm.
be around guest pitching and booking. It could be around interview prep, post production workflow, marketing strategies, even file management, which is something overlooked, but I do all of the time. Whenever you start actually thinking about your podcast as a business and
Mm.
you want to show up as a professional on your podcast, I think that is when you graduate from amateur and move into professional podcaster.
Yeah, that's another great answer.
Thanks.
I should have you on here more. Okay, someone's getting started. They're starting to think of it as a business. We'll say they're professional now. How should they get followers?
This one's tough. Honestly, I'm going to be really frank with a lot of people listening right now. Podcasting is a very tough platform to grow an audience on.
Mm,
The podcast players are still struggling, I think, with search and
mm,
organic growth.
mhm.
Like you can throw up a TikTok or a YouTube short, and you could have 0 followers, 0 subscribers, yet you get 1,000, 3,000, 5,000 views on that video. Podcasting isn't necessarily the same. That's not to say there isn't strategies around growth. And
Sure.
I break the strategies down into kind of 3 different buckets. I think there are strategies for 0 to 100 downloads or
Mm,
followers. There's
mhm.
strategies for 100 to 1,000, and I think there are strategies that are kind of the 1,000 plus. And I'm guessing most people that are listening to this right now either fall into 0 to 100 because they haven't started, or they're podcasting and they just haven't really cracked the code on how to get any traction. And then there might be some people in this 100 to 1,000. But I honestly think the 0 to 100s, don't overcomplicate it. Like identify who your target listener is.
Mhm.
And more than likely, you are probably meeting one of those target listeners every single day.
Mm.
I love kind of one-on-one guerrilla marketing to grow from 0 followers to 100 followers. Like just start telling people about your podcast, put it out to people,
Okay.
and really start sharing about what your mission is behind there and get clear on who you're actually trying to speak to.
Okay, let's talk about that. I want to dive into that a little bit more. So you're meeting people, this guerrilla marketing. What are you saying to them? How are you saying it? Are you saying it in conversation? Are you sending them a LinkedIn message? Or maybe you're already in email correspondence? What does that look like?
Yeah, I love for it to come up organically if possible. So I host a show called The Struggle is Real. The
Mhm.
premise of the show is to speak to 20 somethings that are interested in reaching financial independence by their 30s.
Mm,
And a lot of this comes from a place of desperation because they're not satisfied with work and they want to move towards work optionality and kind of take money out of the equation.
yeah.
So what I did right there is I framed who my target listener is and I
Mm,
got really clear and specific. So anytime that I meet someone
Yeah.
and I start talking to someone about this, like I already know they're a potential target listener.
Yeah.
And just through conversation, a lot of times, since I've made a lot of targeted content for
Mhm.
this listener, like it's just very natural for me to be like, they'll be like, well, traditional or Roth, like what's your opinion? And I'm like, that's a there's a lot of nuance in that question, but I created an episode about that. If you want to
Mm,
go check it out, here's the podcast episode. But here are some of my early elementary thoughts on it. So
yeah.
there's that, like in the
Yeah.
one-to-one communication, a lot
Great.
of that's coming up organically. But also if you're, showing up on social platforms, you're doing targeted daily engagement, which is interacting on social. If it's in
Mhm.
your email signature on your LinkedIn pages, all of this, if you're attracting people
Mm.
to places that are public profiles for you and that information is out there, they'll probably find the content if the content's right for them.
So, two things you just said that really stood out that I want to point out to our audience. One is you've got content that you're creating outside of the podcast that's leading people back to the podcast. I think that's really important. And then the second piece of that was you have a list. This is where that documentation is going to come in handy. You've got a list of your podcast episodes so you can always refer people back to them. That's a strategy that is also used well with video that I've seen and talked with some of our other friends in the marketing space. For advisors who are listening, if you have video, referring people back to a video that answers a question like a prospect has. And then they're also going to find your YouTube channel.
Yep.
So, same strategy. In fact, now that we're talking about YouTube, is YouTube a good place to put your podcast? And should you include video?
I'll definitely answer that, but real quick too, on a follow up on that, I love partnering and strategizing with people like yourself for some of
Mhm.
our clients, because I find there's a lot of natural places to put your content in other areas. So like
Yeah.
I love email and podcasting. I think it's a match made in heaven. I think there's a lot of opportunity whenever someone hits your email sequence for you to add content from your podcast so that it naturally leads people into their podcasts. Because I mentioned podcast is a very mediocre place to grow, but
Yeah.
it's a really great platform to build trust and authority on.
Yes.
There is something about someone consuming 5, 6 of your 30-minute long podcast episodes, and all of a sudden they know who you are. And I know one of the advisors, he uses podcasting in his email sequence and drip campaigns. And 6 emails down is the book a call with me if you have questions. And he tells me routinely people show up to that being like, I think I already kind of know who you are and how you can help me
Yeah.
because I've listened to your podcast and
Right.
you've answered a lot of the questions that have been on my mind. And I trust you already because I've gotten to listen to 4 or 5 hours of free advice from you. And
Mhm.
you've already demonstrated your authority and expertise in my space. So it's a great warm-up mechanism.
So critical for advisors. I mean, we're talking about somebody investing their life savings. There's got to be a lot of trust before they're going to become a prospect or a new client.
Definitely. So let's get to YouTube. I know that was your other question here. Um, Here's my thoughts on video. If you're a first-time podcaster, I almost always recommend don't start with video.
Hmm.
And I know that's maybe contrary to a lot of what people say. If
Mhm.
you're comfortable on camera, maybe you come from content creation already, like you come from YouTube, you've made a lot of short form content. Yeah, then go ahead, turn the video on. I just find with most of my new podcasters that I'm helping launch their show, it becomes a distraction that's not needed early on in the process.
Mhm.
I think video adds a couple of different complexities. All of a sudden, people have to be camera ready anytime they feel like recording, which is a struggle in itself. Like, oh, I got a really good idea. I want to get on mic. I want to hot mic it right now, but I need to go put my makeup on. I need to put some good clothes on. I need to go set my lights up. A lot of those barriers get in the way between you recording the content. So I like to just take that out of the equation. Plus, there's
Yeah.
other tactical things like file management, like a MP3 file versus an MP4 file is just enormous. But it's really hard to also ignore video because I'll be honest,
Mhm.
you're swimming upstream if you're not utilizing video somewhere in your content strategy. All of the platforms right now absolutely love video. I'm thinking YouTube Shorts,
Mhm.
Instagram Reels right now, TikTok, all of them are like I said, organically pushing a lot of the video content that's out there, even YouTube. from a long form standpoint, loves long form podcasting now. And you can tell with with Google's strategy.
Yeah.
Google owns YouTube. They
Mhm.
sunsetted Google Podcast, and your podcast listening is all through YouTube now.
Mm.
They made it really easy to
Mhm.
start podcasting on YouTube by setting up an RSS feed submission. And like if you're on one of the podcast players already, you can automatically push your podcast episodes to YouTube. So it's a great way to get started on YouTube, and it
Yeah.
will come over with just your cover art, and essentially be an audio only. And I
Sure.
do that with a lot of my clients because I'm like, hey, we're gonna set it and forget it. We're gonna set your YouTube channel up. We're gonna push our RSS feed there, and whenever 3 months, 6 months from now, whenever we want to circle back around on video and start a video strategy, we're not starting with 0 subscribers. I found
Right.
we push that out there. They have, maybe they're weekly or bi-weekly. So they have 10 to 25 episodes that are sitting out there. A lot of them are doing like 10 to 100 views. Maybe one or two kind of pop off and do really well because of titling or content.
Mhm.
But like they show up to their YouTube page and they have 150 subscribers. Cool. That's
Yeah.
much easier to start YouTube with 150 versus 0.
Yeah. What about other platforms? So YouTube sounds like, yes, you should post, but wait till you're comfortable on video because there's a lot you got to think about for video, which I can confirm. What about those other platforms? And I mean, how many are there? Should I post to all of them? And how do I post to them?
Oh man, that's just a loaded question. And by no means am I a social media expert. I'm a podcasting strategist, and most of my expertise lies in podcast land. I'm very mediocre when it comes to social media, but I do believe in focusing on a single platform until you feel like you've really conquered that platform. So for many of the advisors out there, that's probably going to be LinkedIn.
Mhm.
And if you drop all the other platforms and only focus on one platform right now, that helps with a lot of the post-production work that's coming out of your podcast. Because more times than not, you're probably wanting to repurpose content from your podcast onto some of the social media platforms. The only problem with that is some are vertical, some are horizontal,
Yes.
some like captions, some auto put captions on, some have 60 seconds, some you can do as long as you want. Like there's all of this nuance in the post-production process that I think gets in the way with a multi-channel or omni-channel approach to social media. But it's
Mhm.
also very hard to ignore the fact that social media is a reliable growth strategy whenever it comes to podcasting or just
Mhm.
audience growth in general. Like you don't
Mhm.
have to convert a bunch of people from your social media channels
Yeah.
to your podcast channels. It's just nice if some of those are married together. If someone is interested in learning more about your podcast, it's out there and they've learned it through social media. And I routinely get people that tell me they've listened to my podcast, but they haven't listened to an episode on a podcast player. They've
Mm.
just watched some clips that I posted on social media.
Right. I guess I should be a little more specific. What podcast streaming platforms should you post to? Because there's a lot. There's Spotify, Apple. I don't know all the names.
Yeah, there's a ton of them that are out there. The great news is you can post to all of them with very minimal effort. And what I mean by that is how podcasting works is you have a podcast. You will then choose a podcast host. This is kind of like your website host. It's a
Okay.
place that's going to have all of your content, and then you link your podcast host to podcast players. So you tell your podcast host, hey, this is Apple, this is Spotify, this is all the other ones that are out there. And if you want a resource, I have a list or like a list of every single podcast player that I could find
Yeah.
where to search or how to search to see if your podcast is on those players. And if not, the instructions for how to get submitted in to that platform. But once you tell your podcast host, I want to publish on that podcast player, now every time you publish a podcast episode, it automatically pushes your podcast to that podcast player. So you only have to do the work once. All of your work really comes inside of your podcast host itself. Did I
This
explain
is a
that?
trick question, Justin, because I already knew the answer.
Yeah.
You knew it because we actually convert these live streams into a podcast. Everybody who's watching.
I had no idea. I'm not even following you on the podcast players. I need to go find you now.
Yeah, you'll probably be our only follower.
What's your podcast? Is it A.U.M or
Yes,
okay?
is marketing. Yep. Um, but I do have a question. So for anyone else who's watching who has started that podcast, and now you've run into some questions. Mine is, are you uploading a different artwork for every episode, or are you using just your standard channel artwork?
Yeah, most of the podcast hosting sites will default to your podcast cover art if you don't otherwise add a episode cover art. I don't know. I'm a little mixed on that. I
Yeah.
haven't seen a difference in terms of downloads or reception one way or another. If you have a good support team and you have the processes in place and you want to kind of have the same look and feel, but maybe every single one of your cover arts has that particular episode's guest on the picture. I like
Mm-hmm.
that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of those things that if you're a team of one or a small team,
Yeah.
don't worry about it right now. I don't think it's going to make or break the
Great.
growth of your podcast. If you can easily add that into your workflow, maybe it's worth looking into and doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, you brought up something, and I also realized I should be paying more attention to the time here because we're getting close to the 30 minutes. But you mentioned artwork having, if you have a guest on, and should I have guests if I have a podcast?
Yes and no, maybe. This is a maybe question for me. And
Yeah.
I think this all circles back to what's the goal of your podcast? And with the goal of your podcast, then what is the appropriate strategy for your podcast?
Mm-hmm.
So I have like a list of like 15 potential goals
Mm-hmm.
that podcasting can help with. And I make my clients rank order all of those. And then we chop out the bottom third.
Mm-hmm.
And then we chop out the middle third, and then we have 5 that are typically left, and I have found the top 5 are typically 1 of 8, and then I force them to pick of those 5, which are the 2 most important. And more times than not, it is, a networking strategy,
Mm-hmm.
it is a lead generation strategy, it is a, content hub strategy, so they wanna create a podcast, and they want that podcast to create 20 other pieces of content to fill out, the rest of their social media channels.
Yeah.
It could be a resource hub for their current clients, or it could be a thought leadership personal branding play.
Yeah.
With all of those goals, I think there are different strategies. I think the most obvious one here is if you want to prioritize networking through
Mm-hmm.
podcasting,
Mm-hmm.
because I really do think, just like we're doing right now, there's
Yep.
something special about creating content with someone else
Mm-hmm.
and how that helps people get closer and how you can build authority or how you can build a relationship with somebody.
Right.
And you get access to people because they're also showing up on a platform and they're going to get PR. I do think podcast guesting is probably, or having guests on your podcast is probably the appropriate strategy. But something like personal brand, if you rank that as number one, maybe not necessarily. Maybe you should only do monologues.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of nuance in all of this too.
Right.
Like what are you really trying to do? And then also how much resources do you have behind podcasting to really help me decide, is having guests the right fit for you or not?
Um, okay, you said a few things there that I want to go back and point out. One of them was, I can't remember what they were. Two things. One is that you said something that I preach all the time. I say there are 3 things you need to do to be successful in marketing: know your audience, know your goal, know the steps to get to your goal. And he basically just repeated that. So that makes me so happy.
And I'll reinforce it's a very similar strategy with podcasting, probably because podcasting is one avenue of marketing.
Right, exactly. Something else you said that I thought was interesting that maybe would be useful for an advisor when they've got prospects coming in. It's actually not really related to the podcast, but your process. And that is, you come in and you give them a list of, here are like outcomes, basically. Which one's your priority? I think that's great because you're kind of establishing what you can do and which one they want to pursue. I might have to steal that from you, Justin. Right now, with my clients, I say, what do you want to achieve? But I like this method where I'm saying, here are things that are possible. What's important to you?
Yeah.
So I just want to point that out. I think that's a great process there.
That was lots of trial and error. And I kept like running into this issue with clients where I'm like, why do I feel like we're moving the goalpost all of the time? You just told me 3 months ago that like you developing relationships with your guests is the most important thing. So we put a lot of time and effort
Mhm.
into guest communication and having really good guest pitching
Yeah.
and the follow-up process for whenever a guest comes on the show, and highlighting the guest through really personalized repurposed content, all of that. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh man, my show's not growing. I really want to focus on growing my show and growing my listenership. And I'm like, well,
Hmm.
that's a different strategy then.
Right.
Like, then we need to think about all of these things over here. Maybe it's more of a content play.
Right.
Maybe it's more dialed in episodes. Maybe it's about marketing tactics, and you should be guesting, not having guest on your show.
Right.
So yeah, it's I struggled with it a lot whenever I first started working with clients, and then I realized I need to lay out all of the things they could potentially get from podcasting, tell them that we are capable of hitting a lot of these, but then realistically explaining, hey, this is our number one priority with podcasting, and definitely until we feel like we have gotten what we've gotten
Mm,
from focusing on this, and then we move to the secondary or the third goal that's out there.
that's interesting. So one way we kind of keep our goals present is we do quarterly metrics with our clients, and we always repeat back, this is the goal that you said
Smart.
you want to achieve. Then we're going to show how we are successful in getting you that goal.
Mhm.
Um, Speaking of our processes, for anyone watching, make sure you get our newsletter every week. It goes out on Thursdays. Just scan this QR code. Also, if you haven't noticed, up in the left-hand corner of the screen is a QR code to Justin's podcast production studio website. So make sure you check that out. And I'm 99% sure that there is also a link there to his podcast, The Struggle is Real. Yes.
Yep.
Which might actually be something advisors who have clients who have kids, that might be something they're interested in.
I get that a lot with some of my clients. I'm like, oh man, you're probably a good show for me to share with my clients so they can share it with
Yep.
their kids. And yes, I love whenever that happens.
Yes. So we are getting close to the 30-minute mark. I didn't get to ask you anything about equipment. So I think it's just obvious, Justin, I'm going to have you on for a part 2 later in the year.
Let's do it.
So stay posted for that. Is there anything that you would tell somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast to encourage them to go for it?
We can circle back around to the very first thing, which is just literally start and go for it. And I think podcasting doesn't have a ton of barriers to entry. Like, if you legit want to just record on your phone and then upload that raw audio to a podcast player, cool, you can do that. If you want to hire a team like mine and have a full-blown production and have an entire strategy built around podcasting, you can do that as well. And you're allowed to transition throughout your whole podcasting journey closer to what you ultimately want.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, I think it's a really great avenue and a really great platform to build trust and authority with your clients. And you can add as much effort or energy into that platform as you want.
That's so great. So anyone watching, one more time, Justin's link to his website is in the corner here in the QR code. Thank you so much, Justin. This was so fun.
Thanks so much, Callie.
So everyone who's watching, join us next Monday. We're actually going to continue talking about podcasting. We're going to be talking with Joe Saul Seahigh from the podcast Stacking Benjamins, 2-time winner of the Plutus Best Podcast Award, which I didn't know what that was, but apparently it's a big deal, and named 2023 Best Personal Finance Podcast by Bankrate. So if that's something you've been thinking about, how can you make your podcast into a business? come to next week's episode where we're going to pick his brain about how he went from personal finance sphere to one of the most listened to podcasts with over 6,000 subscribers. Maybe you can learn some strategies to implement